So the first news story that we have is Sean O'Malley shares thoughts on potential Pereira versus Chimaev matchup. Now, basically what Sean O'Malley goes over in this interview is, again, how that matchup would go. And Sean O'Malley surprisingly picks Khamzat Chimaev to win between him and Alex Pereira. And to be honest, I completely agree with him. And the reason why is because this is really the perfect timing for Khamzat to go to the middleweight division, and honestly at the same time, the welterweight division. Now, the only problem that everyone talks about with Chimaev is that whenever someone can basically stop his takedowns, it's just dramatically harder for him to stand and strike because he does not move his head very well, doesn't have the best footwork. He just kind of walks guys down like a Terminator and throws punches and kind of relies on his chin a little bit like Jiri Prochazka. And in the short term, yeah, that's going to work, but in the long term, that is not going to work. Someone who kind of comes to mind is Dominic Reyes, where he got hit a good bit coming up the light heavyweight division's rankings. And even whenever he was in that title fight with John Jones, he did really well, but at the same time, he did get hit. And it's just whenever you do get hit, you're eventually going to get knocked out. And once you get knocked out once, twice, three times, that chin's gone, and now you really don't have that base for defense. That's really, I would say, the only big hole whenever it comes to Khamzat Chimaev, is that he does not move his head very well, does not have a lot of elusive footwork. I would say those are probably the biggest holes in his game, if you can really even call those holes. Now, what has to happen for someone to exploit those holes in the first place is for him to not take them down. So in the welterweight division, I don't think that there's a person in the welterweight division who can stop him from taking them down. And the reason why is because the dude cuts so much weight. He's almost like the Alex Pereira of the welterweight division in terms of weight cutting. Now, obviously, they have two completely different styles, but honestly, even in that way, Alex Pereira is a complete specialist, and then he trains just enough in takedown defense, in defensive wrestling, to keep it to where his specialty can flourish, where he can actually just do whatever he wants to on the feet. In the same way, Khamzat Chimaev, he wants it to go to the ground, so he gets just good enough at striking so that he can stand, long enough, however long he needs to, before he shoots for the takedown. Something that I've also heard is that before this fight, Dana White was wanting to have Khamzat Chimaev fight Colby Covington. And I think that is just such an interesting fight, and I think everyone would really agree with that, is that would be very interesting. Number one, because Dana White wants to make sure that Khamzat can actually make the weight of 170. And rightfully so. He almost destroyed that entire fight card. That was one of the most hyped fight cards in the entire year. But with Colby Covington, Colby doesn't really cut a ton of weight. And whenever you're looking at both these guys wrestling-wise, honestly, I could see this going a very similar way than the Khamzat Chimaev versus Kevin Holland fight, where Khamzat understands his weaknesses, I think. He understands, okay, I only have this much gas. Especially after that horrible, horrible weight cut, that his gas tank was completely compromised, or at least I would assume so. And obviously that's where Colby shines. But whenever Colby beats guys, he does not beat them up quickly. It takes time. Khamzat is going to outweigh Colby, I would say anywhere between 15 and maybe 30 pounds, something like that. Maybe even more on fight day. And especially whenever you're talking about elite grapplers, that's going to matter a whole heck of a lot. And honestly, I just think that Khamzat is too big. Whenever you think about somebody who cut an enormous amount of weight, surprisingly, actually in the welterweight division as well, was Darren Till. Darren Till cut so much weight, and he even bragged about it. He's like, how could this possibly be legal? Like, I'm cutting so much weight and I'm beating up on these tiny little guys, and I'm so much bigger than they are. But then whenever he got his title shot against Woodley, the better wrestler, landed, a punch that dropped him. But then once he got dropped, it was impossible for him to get back up just because Woodley's wrestling was so much higher than Darren Till's. But for a guy like Khamzat Chimaev, whenever you have a heavy wrestling style, weight is much more of a factor than whenever striking is your main avenue to winning. And that's why I think, honestly, right now, Khamzat Chimaev is going to blow through everyone. Obviously, guys at the top of the food chain, like Usman, like potentially Colby, could give him some sort of a problem, especially since Colby's chin is so freaking good. But to be honest, I kind of see those fights going very quickly, and I still see him ragdolling a guy like Colby Covington. The best chance I think of anybody in that division just slowing him down is Usman. And the reason why is because Usman will not do super well in the wrestling, I think, because I think they're pretty dang close whenever it comes to wrestling skill. But it's just whenever one guy outweighs the other guy by so much, it's going to be very, very difficult. And also, Khamzat Chimaev seems to have much, much better Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu than Kamaru Usman as well. But whenever it comes to the standing game, I think Usman actually has him beat. But the problem is that I don't think it's going to remain standing. I think Chimaev is going to be going hard on the takedowns against Usman if that's who he faces. And I think ultimately he will be welterweight champion potentially by the end of 2023. Now, whenever it comes to the middleweight for Khamzat Chimaev, things get a lot more interesting. And the reason why is because this is his true weight at 185 pounds. And it's funny because Alex Pereira is doing the exact same thing in the middleweight division that Chimaev is doing in the welterweight division. It's reported that Alex Pereira is walking around at well over 200 pounds. And then it's reported that Chimaev is walking around well over 200 pounds. And it's kind of hard to tell like where they're at whenever they're cutting all this weight and how much muscle do they have after they cut all the water and all that jazz. So it would be very interesting, I think, to see both of those guys fight. I think even more interesting than really anybody in the welterweight division, because I don't really see anybody in the welterweight division giving Chimaev too much trouble. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see that, because Pereira has really not gone up against super strong wrestlers. Now, pretty much that's the number one question for people is how would Alex Pereira do against somebody like Vettori? How would he do against, other great wrestlers in the middleweight division? But at the same time, obviously everybody wants to see him fight Robert Whittaker because of just that horrible stylistic matchup of elusive footwork, so he doesn't get hit, but also elite wrestling and elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. However, I don't think we even need to go that far to find a matchup that can beat Alex Pereira. I think someone like Chimaev really could beat Pereira. And honestly, I'm going to agree with Sean O'Malley in that I think Khamzat Chimaev could beat Alex Pereira pretty easily. And the reason why is because you can tell that Alex's wrestling is still extremely, extremely new, we'll say. And it's not hating on him. It's not talking crap about him. It's just it's impossible to get to a certain level in a certain amount of time. A guy like Chimaev has been wrestling his entire life, just like Alex has been striking for years and years and years and years. And to be honest, I think Chimaev is probably better at wrestling than Alex is at striking. It'll honestly just be super interesting to see where the UFC takes this, because I know that the UFC really like Khamzat Chimaev, and I think they like Alex as well, but I feel like they really are putting a lot of their eggs into the Chimaev basket. And I think that's why even whenever he missed weight and he really, really missed up that fight card, that huge pay-per-view where, Nate Diaz and Chimaev, they're not champions or anything, but they're still headlining the UFC card, and then he misses weight. If that was anybody else, the UFC would have just destroyed him, possibly even cut him from the promotion because he's not reliable. But because they like Khamzat Chimaev so much, they cared, but they really let that one go. Because I think that someone like Chimaev really is maybe the only chance for someone really in the near future at all to get 3 belts. I could see him easily snatching up the welterweight division belt. I think it would be relatively easy for him to get the middleweight belt. And whenever it comes to even the light heavyweight division, there's really nobody who stands out very much at all. I mean, again, you have Jan Blachowicz. He's getting very old. You have Glover Teixeira. He's getting very old. You have Jiri Prochazka. He has great striking, great movement, but does not have very good wrestling at all. So something that I would be pretty confident in predicting for 2023 is Khamzat Chimaev beating Colby Covington or whoever the UFC throws at him to make sure that he can make 170 pounds, then him winning the 170-pound belt, then him going up and facing the 185-pound champion, beating them, getting that belt, double champ status, then going up to light heavyweight division and beating that champion as well. Now, this kind of segues into our next topic, which is Jiri Prochazka vacating the light heavyweight championship. And the reason for this is because he had a shoulder injury in his training camp. And again, it's very, very sad just because Jiri Prochazka had so much promise as a UFC champion. And his fight with Glover Teixeira was one of the best fights in UFC history. It might even be one of the candidates for Fight of the Year this year. But whenever it comes to the light heavyweight division, I thought that there would be a little bit of like a restructuring of the light heavyweight division. That's a lot of times what happens whenever someone vacates. A lot of times whenever a division has a dominant champion, but then they get beat by someone else, again, that's typically just a changing of the guard. However, with the light heavyweight division, there were dominant champions. Obviously, there were dominant champions in the light heavyweight division in the early 2000s, and you had the Chuck Liddell era, you had the Tito Ortiz era, all that stuff. But then after Chuck, Tito, the big stars, Randy Couture, after the big stars went away, then you had the era of basically the champions who won the belt, maybe defended once, but that was it. And then again, you got to the moments, with Forrest Griffin, Rashad Evans, Rampage, Lyoto Machida, all that stuff. And then you get to Shogun and you're like, okay, he was great in Pride, killed it. Maybe he's going to be the next one. And then John Jones comes by and just obliterates him. And I think it's moments like that whenever you really figure out who is the next in line whenever it comes to the changing of the guard. Whenever John Jones beats Shogun, everyone really knew that that was it. That was going to be the next era in the UFC, and especially in the light heavyweight division. And after John Jones left, vacated, that always kind of hurts with just like the optics. It's kind of like whenever Michael Bisping got submitted by George St. Pierre and then George St. Pierre left. And I know it's not maybe fair to say, but I think most people know that Robert Whittaker is better than Michael Bisping. It's kind of obvious. But the thing is that no one saw Robert Whittaker beat Michael Bisping and have that kind of linear championship mindset to it. And it kind of hurts the optics of the weight division that way. And so far with John Jones being away for nearly 3 years now of the light heavyweight division, no one has really claimed that spot yet. And the only thing that I will say is that it's been 3 years. So I would say very, very soon there will be that fighter. And Jiri Prochazka, I don't know, is that guy. I respect the heck out of him for kind of pulling like a George St. Pierre and saying, hey, listen, I don't think that I'm going to be back for a long time. Apparently this was a shoulder injury in training, but I definitely respect him for vacating the title and not holding on to it for a year, trying to get healthy and just holding up the whole division. But at the same time, one thing that I do say is that the fight is not just the night of the fight. The fight is always happening. Whenever you are in training camp and you're rolling, whenever you're striking, that is part of the fight. And the reason why is because if you train in a certain way, if you train unintelligently and you injure yourself, and obviously sometimes this happens even if you do train extremely intelligently, but again, this is part of the fight game. Whenever you are, let's say, doing a wrestling tournament or something, if you are sick on that day, if you're sick on the day of competition and you don't show up, the tournament still happens. And they count you for a loss if you did not show up. They will raise the other guy's hand without you even there. And that's what happens in war. That's what happens anywhere. If you don't show up, you lost. And that's why, again, it sucks, that they didn't face each other, and you can't say, oh yeah, Glover beat Jiri Prochazka because Jiri Prochazka didn't show up. Not in that sense, but it's that the fight always happens. John Jones used to say that he would party and drink and go crazy the week before the fight so that he had an excuse in his head if somehow he lost. And as much as I kind of understand where he's coming from in a weird way, that still doesn't matter to me. Because if, let's say, Daniel Cormier is a straight arrow and he goes and shows up every day and he trains, in a smart, intelligent way, and John Jones goes out and parties and he doesn't train in a smart, intelligent way, and then he shows up in the fight and he's all banged up and he has a fractured vertebrae and he has a concussion and he's hungover, and then DC beats him, DC still beat him, and DC still is the better fighter, not because of skill or talent or anything like that, but because of everything that creates a fighter, everything that creates a championship performance is part of the fight, not just the kicks and the punches. Everything that happens from the training camp to the weight cuts to the fight itself is the fight. And that's why I'm not throwing any kind of shade at Jiri Prochazka. It's just that I don't know if he's really the next era. And with this new light heavyweight championship in Jan Blachowicz and Magomed Ankalaev, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, I could definitely see Ankalaev being the next generation. This is honestly his time to really show us the next era in the light heavyweight division. If we're being honest, Jan Blachowicz is not the next era. He is getting up there in age. He was already champion and lost it. But Ankalaev, he, again, has one loss on his record at all. And he has that new era of Dagestani wrestling. So I would say that he has a great chance to kind of prove that he's the next in line, especially whenever it comes to the light heavyweight division. Because, to be honest, if Chimaev comes up and fights a Jiri Prochazka or somebody like that, someone who, again, is good, but who just has like a giant hole in their game, it would be a little bit embarrassing for a guy who can make 170 pounds to beat a light heavyweight. But could I see Khamzat Chimaev beating Ankalaev? No. His wrestling is, I would say, on a similar level to Chimaev's, and then him and Chimaev are probably about the same size. Ankalaev might be a little bit bigger. So that's someone who I think could actually win the belt and defend several times. And yes, so I will leave you with this. Last weekend of fights was a little bit underwhelming, especially because Derek Lewis had that medical issue where he had to pull out of the fight last minute, and they had to put somebody else in the main event. That fight was great and everything, but at the same time, it is unfortunate whenever you have a UFC card that doesn't have a ton of stars on it, even whenever it is a fight night card. However, the fight night that's coming up, not this weekend, but next weekend on December 3rd, Saturday, it is headlined by Stephen Thompson and Kevin Holland, which should be amazing. They're finally throwing Kevin Holland, another striker. Like, after Chimaev just ragdolled him and just destroyed him so quickly, that broke Kevin Holland. Like, Kevin Holland's like, dude, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, if there's someone out there in the world that can do that to me, I have no business being in here. And it honestly is very scary to see a guy like that, because in the UFC, you usually do not see fighters break. You do not see fighters just get destroyed like that, not even physically, but mentally. And Kevin Holland's a pretty mentally tough guy, but to literally say, I'm going to retire if y'all don't give me another striker, or if y'all give me another wrestler, I'm out. I mean, that's scary. But yeah, that fight should be absolutely wonderful. We have some other big names that are on the card are Rafael dos Santos. We have Tai Tuivasa. Obviously, everyone loves Tai Tuivasa. Derek Brunson versus Jack Hermanson. Oh my goodness, just give like both of those like a wrestling singlet, and I will definitely be watching that fight. And then even in the preliminary card, you have Nico Price, who's always crazy to watch, Angela Hill, Clay Guida. Wow, I cannot believe that he's actually still in the UFC. Michael Johnson's fighting for Clay Guida, which again, that should be very interesting as well. And for this to be a fight night card that's for free on ESPN Plus, that's actually pretty shocking, because this is like a wonderful, wonderful fight night card. But yeah, so that's all the MMA news for this week. I'm planning on doing these short form podcast kind of MMA news weekly. So if you like this format, just hit the like button so that I know that this is something interesting. And if you really like it and you want to see more, you want to see these weekly videos, go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see y'all in the next one.